Rock climbing history is littered with controversy. Usually, these disputes are about specific routes, grades, or ethics, but sometimes things get personal. These are the most hated rock climbers of all time who have allegedly faked ascents, been shot at for their ethical views, and ruined one of the most iconic routes in the world. Hey, I'm Marcus, and this is Climbing Explained, sponsored by Element. Now, before we go any farther, I want to make clear that I personally have nothing against any of these climbers, but they're the people who, throughout their careers, have faced the most intensive criticism from the climbing community as a whole. First up, we have a former child prodigy who is accused of both manufacturing routes and faking an ascent, all within the span of a few years. Meet BERNABE Fernandez. When he was younger, Fernandez was one of the most promising prodigies in the rock climbing world, but in the late 1990s, things took a turn for the worse. It started in 1996 when Fernandez sent the route Araujo and graded it 9A. Now, from the very beginning, Araujo was controversial. When he first tried the moves on Araujo, Fernandez said that they felt almost inhuman but not impossible for the future. Because of that, he bolted some artificial holds onto the rock to make the route easier. In 1996, he sent the route and graded it 9A, and that kicked off a decade of controversy for BERNABE. Soon, fellow Spanish crusher Dani Andrade started projecting the route and found a new way of climbing on those artificial holds that made the route easier. Fernandez wasn't happy with this. In his own words, "I decided to return to the route and make some modifications so that the route would be forced to be carried out just as I had done it, maintaining the difficulty of 9A. The climbing community did not like this. People saw this as Fernandez being bitter and overly protective of his route and not wanting it to be downgraded, but things would only get worse from there. In 1998, BERNABE went back to Araujo. Stronger than he had been 2 years ago, he removed the artificial holds and sent the route again, this time assigning it the grade of 9A+. This made it the first ever 9A+ in the world, but the climbing community was furious. By this point, people thought that Fernandez had gone too far. According to Spanish magazine Desnivel, the movement did not have many supporters. The route continued to be manufactured, and many saw it as a climbing wall game in which the route setter models the difficulties by adding and removing holds. Basically, people thought that Fernandez had gone too far with his chipping and manufacturing. This cost him a huge amount of credibility. Dani Andrade himself commented, saying, "Fernandez did things that don't seem right to me. You have to respect the rock and also the ways to solve steps of other climbers." So, after Araujo, Fernandez already had a poor reputation in the climbing community, but the worst of it was yet to come. In 2003, BERNABE announced that he had sent the route CHILAM BILAM and graded it 9B+. At the time, this was 2 full grades harder than the hardest routes in the world, and this time, the climbing community really came for Fernandez. People were convinced that either BERNABE hadn't sent the route or he had overgraded it. Alex Huber went online saying, "I cannot take BERNABE's proposal seriously. I would be lying if I said I believe the correctness of the 9B+ grade." To make matters worse, Fernandez refused to name his belayer or provide any proof that he had climbed CHILAM BILAM. At this point, the climbing community was done with Fernandez, and Fernandez was done with the climbing community. He stepped away from the sport for more than 3 years, taking a break from the vitriol he had suffered and the controversy he had created. At the end of the day, I think the story of BERNABE Fernandez is sort of sad. Obviously, he made mistakes, but he also established some cutting-edge climbs, and it's a shame that some of these routes have been marred by the controversial ethics he used when climbing them. While Fernandez caught some flack for manufacturing holds, it was nothing compared to the sheer hatred faced by the next climber on our list, Louis Anderson, who has such a reputation for artificially modifying routes that he's been referred to as Gluey Louis. Before we talk about Gluey Louis though, we need to talk about today's sponsor, Element. Even if you're not putting up the hardest routes in the world, allegedly, like BERNABE Fernandez, rock climbing is hard work, and Element is an electrolyte mixture specifically designed to help you climb longer and recover more quickly. Element's scientifically designed electrolyte formula works so well that they were the exclusive partner of the US Olympic weightlifting team, who might not work as hard as you do sending V2 at the local gym, but that's still pretty impressive. Head to drinklmnt.com/climberscrag to get a free sample pack with any purchase and enjoy Element's risk-free guarantee. To understand the hatred towards Gluey Louie, you need to understand the concept of manufacturing routes. As a whole, the climbing community is diametrically opposed to the idea of manufacturing a route, that is, changing the character of the rock by adding holds or intentionally breaking them off in order to make the climb easier or harder. According to a climbing.com survey, almost 90% of climbers are opposed to the idea of manufacturing a route. The most common objections are that it's bad for the environment, it removes the challenge from climbing, and it makes it so that future generations will never be able to try the routes in their natural states. Louis Anderson does not agree with these objections. According to a Gripped article, Anderson believes leaving difficult climbs for the future is and that every route should be 5 stars. Basically, Anderson thinks that outdoor routes should be glued, chipped, and manufactured until they're as fun as possible, in the same way that you would change the holds on an indoor route to make it fun. Now, through his early career, this wasn't that big of a deal. Anderson put up routes on Chauncey Quarries and other obscure locations in Southern California that no one really cared about, but a few years ago, he took his ethics to one of the most beloved climbing locations in the western US. In 2017, Louis moved to 10 Sleep Canyon, a popular sport climbing crag in Wyoming. Pretty soon, 10 Sleep locals began to notice routes going up on previously unclimbable cliffs. These routes were traced back to Louis, and controversy exploded. Soon, word got out that Anderson was trying to publish a 10 Sleep guidebook that included routes that he had chipped, glued, and drilled to create. 10 Sleep climbers saw this as Louis trying to profit off of manufacturing at their local crag, and they went public, publishing an open letter exposing what Anderson had done and calling for him to stop. Immediately, the climbing community turned on Anderson. Look at some of these comments. That's just f***ing nuts and totally out of line. What kind of slimy human being would destroy beautiful rock like that for a f***ing book? What a scumbag. And chop all his bolts. If he rebolts, chop them again. Hit him in the wallet because the head and the heart don't seem to be effective targets for this guy. I mean, jeez. The online response was heated, but in 10 Sleep Canyon, things got even more extreme. More than 70 of Louis' routes had their bolts chopped or padlocked so they were unclimbable. As for Louis, he probably faced more blowback than any climber ever has. According to Rock and Ice, he's been threatened, assaulted, and even shot at while climbing in 10 Sleep, which just shows how extreme some people's views are concerning climbing ethics. As far as I can tell though, Louis is still in 10 Sleep Canyon, still trying to find the right balance, which is more than you can say about the next climber who was actually forced to flee Yosemite and the sport of climbing altogether after ruining one of the most iconic routes in the world. In the 1970s, Yosemite Valley was probably the epicenter of the climbing world. Chiefs of this kingdom were the Stonemasters, a group of young, insanely devoted rock climbing hippies who lived by a strict ethical code. The Stonemasters had a lot of beliefs about the way things should be climbed, and these would be the source of probably the worst incident of chipping that climbing has ever seen. It started with an outsider who didn't really understand the ethics of the Stonemasters. Ray Jardine was an aerospace engineer and a born-again Christian who definitely did not fit in with the hippie crowd of the 70s. However, he was an incredibly strong climber and he put up some really impressive routes in Yosemite. Even before he chipped one of the most iconic routes of all time, Ray had a history of questionable ethics. On a route called the Phoenix, where the crack was too narrow to fit his fingers, Jardine repeatedly hammered in a piton to widen the crack so that he could climb it. This raised some eyebrows, but pin scars were common enough in Yosemite and no one really cared too much about it. Jardine was somewhat unpopular, sure, but he wasn't hated. That is, until he took his methods to one of the most sacred routes in the valley. In the world of Yosemite climbing, perhaps no route is more iconic than the nose, and in the 1980s, people began to pursue the idea of free climbing it. Jardine was one of these people, but his drive to succeed took him too far. On one of his trips up the nose, Jardine found himself stumped by a 35-foot blank stretch of rock. Instead of giving in and retreating like every other party before him had done, he chiseled a series of holds onto the face of El Capitan, making the section climbable, but at a price. Those holds that Jardine chipped are there forever. No one knows if that section was climbable in its natural state, and no one ever will. Now, to an outsider, this might not sound that bad. It's just 35 feet of rock, but this is a huge deal. Once you chip a few holds on a rock, what's to stop you from just chipping a line all the way to the top? Why not make the holds bigger so anyone can climb them? To a lot of people, doing this ruins the entire point of climbing, which is to test yourself against the line that's been created naturally. What Jardine did was at best short-sighted and at worst selfish, as he took that line away from future climbers who might have aspired to climb it without modifying the holds. To the Stonemasters who dedicated their lives to the idea of free climbing, this was the last straw, and they lashed out at Jardine. John Long, still mad about this 40 years later, said chipping El Cap was He did it so brazenly, I just can't imagine doing that. It was so disrespectful. It was sacrilege. According to historian Jeff Smoot, the Phoenix had stirred some grumblings, but it was nothing compared to the vitriolic fire Jardine drew for openly chiseling holds on the nose. It was unforgivable, and Jardine was vilified. Unlike Louis Anderson, Jardine didn't stick around when he was criticized. Tired of the backlash, sick of the rules and hatred he was facing, he left climbing altogether. While no one defends what he did on the nose, it is sad that one of the best climber of his era was chased away from the sport rather than, being educated. And to this day, Ray Jardine stands as maybe the most vilified rock climber of all time.
Oi, looking to watch more? Why not give this a watch?